global Muslim leader, calls for de-escalation of Palestine-Israel war. If the Muslims unite and are one, they will have a strong and impactful voice. Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, the world head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, the fifth Caliph, His Holiness, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, has condemned the killing of innocent civilians on both sides in the war between Hamas and Israel, and expressed his fear that the situation would continue to spiral out of all control. Speaking during his Friday sermon at the Mubarak Mosque in Islamabad, Tilford, on the 13th October 2023, His Holiness urged the Muslim world to set aside their differences in order to raise a voice for those innocent Palestinians who have no link to terrorism or extremism, and said that major powers should prioritize de-escalation and finding a just solution to the conflict. Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad said, "For the past few days a war has ensued between Hamas and Israel. As a result, women, children, and the elderly have been killed and are continuing to lose their lives without any distinction." Reminding Muslims of the Islamic injunctions, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad said, "Even in a state of war, Islam does not permit the killing of women, children, elderly, and innocent civilians. The Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, gave strict instructions against doing so. In this recent escalation of the war, Hamas made the first move and attacked Israeli citizens. Leaving aside for a moment the fact that innocent people have been unjustly killed by the Israeli army, Muslims should ensure that they always adhere to the teachings of Islam." Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad continued, "Where the Israeli army has carried out injustices, that is on them, and there are better and lawful ways to address that. If there is a legitimate state of war, it should be entirely limited to the respective armies and never against innocent women, children, elderly, and civilians. In this respect, the action Hamas took must be condemned." Speaking of the actions of the Israeli military, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad said, "Whatever injustice and cruelty Hamas committed, the response to that or war should have been restricted to Hamas. However, the indiscriminate response of the Israeli government is extremely dangerous, and it seems that this conflict will not end here. In fact, it cannot even be imagined how many innocent women, children, elderly, and civilians will lose their lives. The Israeli government has suggested it will destroy Gaza, and to this end they have carried out severe and overwhelming bombardment. They have turned the city to dust. Now the most recent development is that the Israeli government is telling 1 million or so people to leave northern Gaza immediately." Speaking of the reaction of the United Nations, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad said, "Thankfully, albeit with much hesitation, the United Nations is at least now raising a faint voice in response to this development. They have said it is against human rights and would create huge problems, and so Israel should think about their decision, rather than unequivocally saying that it is wrong, and instead of taking a stronger stance, the United Nations is making mere requests." His Holiness again reminded of the fact that innocent children dying on both sides is completely wrong, and the world should not forget that Palestinian children are as innocent as the children in Israel. His Holiness also reminded of the teachings of the Jewish faith in relation to wars, and said that the teachings of the people of the book is clear that killing innocent people is impermissible, and that where Israel says that Hamas is killing innocent people, it should also see its own actions and judge whether it falls in line with its own religious teachings. His Holiness also reminded of the fact that for a long period of time he has been urging major world powers to leave aside dishonest behavior whilst establishing absolute justice, regardless of where their own interests lie. If, His Holiness said, they had done so, the situation in Palestine and Israel would not reach this critical stage. Speaking of how the emphasis to take any action is all against the Palestinians, His Holiness mentioned that there is news that the armed forces of several countries from around the world are preparing to come to the region against the Palestinians, and major Western powers are also preparing harsh measures against the Palestinians whilst setting aside the principles of justice. His Holiness highlighted the double standards in this conflict by mentioning how there are reports of videos and imagery showing innocent Israeli women and children being harmed which have garnered much sympathy from people. Later, when it has come to light that those innocent women and children were in fact Palestinians, there is no similar level of sympathy to be found in the media for them. Speaking of this, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad said, "Such people only care for the rule of might is right, and they simply bow to those who hold strength and power in the world. If one analyzes this, it seems that major powers are bent upon inciting war, rather than ending it. Speaking of the role of the United Nations in establishing justice, His Holiness recounted how the League of Nations failed as a result of failing to implement justice, which led to World War II, in which tens of millions of people were killed. Now His Holiness said, the United Nations too is failing to establish justice, and is heading in the same direction. Regarding the possible destruction that could easily result from this war, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad said, an ordinary person cannot even imagine the war that may now ensue as a result of the injustices that have been seen. The major powers know the intensity of the damage it will cause, yet they are not interested in establishing justice, and are unwilling to pay heed. Hazrat Mirza Masroor reminded the Muslim governments of their responsibilities, and said, in these circumstances the Muslims should at least realize their responsibility and should pay heed. They must set aside their differences, and must establish their unity, in order to better their relationships with the people of the Book. If Allah has given the commandment to the Muslims to call them towards a word equal between us and you, by uniting over the unity of God, then Muslims who have the same creed should unite between themselves even more so by setting aside their differences. They should ponder over this and should establish their unity. This is the only way of removing injustice from the world, and of fulfilling the obligations of justice, and of establishing the rights of the oppressed. In order to do so, the Muslims must raise a strong voice in unison whilst coming together for those that are downtrodden across the world. Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad further stated, if the Muslims unite and are one, they will have a strong and impactful voice. Otherwise, the Muslim governments would be responsible for the deaths of innocent Muslims. Always keep the saying of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, in mind, and this should be borne in mind by the major powers as well, that we must help both the oppressor and the oppressed. We must understand the importance of this injunction. Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad prayed and said, may Allah guide the Muslim powers so that they may unite in order to establish true justice. May the major world powers of the world also be granted right-mindedness, so that instead of taking the world towards destruction, they try to save it. They should not make it their objective to simply fulfill their selfish desires. They should always remember that if and when there is destruction, the major powers too will not be safe from it. His Holiness said that the only weapon Ahmadi Muslims possess and turn to is that of prayers, and so urged Ahmadi Muslims to use this spiritual weapon more than ever before. Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad said, may Allah give sense to Hamas as well. May they not become the reason for the injustices against their own people, and may they not carry out barbaric cruelties and injustices against others. If they are to fight, then they should do so in light of the just principles of Islam, wherein an enmity of a nation should not incite us to act otherwise than with justice. This is the commandment of Allah the Almighty. May Allah enable the major powers to fulfill the obligations of justice on both sides of the conflict in order to establish peace. It should not be that they become lenient towards one side at the cost of the other. May they not increase in injustice, and may we see peace with our eyes in the world.